A look at media bias throughout a presidential election by Lisa G. Pikeman, Eastern Illinois University, fall semester 2012. Media bias is not a recent phenomenon, but dates back to as early as the partisan press era. Journalists are not the only guilty parties when it comes to slanted journalism. The political preferences of the owners, operators, and managers can also determine the viewpoint of the story. Studies indicate media bias exists, and media bias is never more evident than during an election year. Bias can be defined as a pattern of constant favoritism, and it occurs when a political party or candidate is covered more often or more favorably. Even with a precise definition and the obvious pattern of occurrence, media bias is truly within the eyes of the beholder. During the partisan press era, newspapers were operated or had close ties to one or both major political parties. When Benjamin Day created the Sun, he was credited with the penny press. Newspapers were no longer just a luxury for the wealthy, but now affordable to everyone. Prior to the penny press, the partisan press was void of advertisements and sold for around a nickel each. Penny press newspapers no longer had close ties to one party or another, but now advertising dollars dictated the slant of their stories. It wasn't until the next century that the Fairness Doctrine was established. After its birth in 1949, the Fairness Doctrine was not largely enforced, and it was renounced in 1987. The doctrine's two basic elements required that controversial matters be discussed and that sufficient time be allowed for both sides of the controversial discussion. While there is no way to police or regulate equal amounts of time for each side, the public is the real loser in this situation. The majority of the public wants only impartial and detached presentation of important news. Presidential campaigns and elections are a sequence of spirited events designed to help a democratic society choose a leader. And as Americans, we have the daunting task of selecting the leader of the free world for the next 4 years. The election of a single individual to serve is of great importance and is a main focus of the news media. Due to time and travel restraints, few people actually attend political rallies and therefore rely on the message being delivered via the media. Because voters receive the politician's message indirectly, the chances of increased media bias are even more prominent by editing, altering, or completely taking out of context the politician's message. Also, the media is in the unique situation and has the advantage of determining what the public should be thinking about, and listening to, and reading about. An excellent example of this was during the Benghazi attack. Major networks buried the story to fourth, fifth, sixth story of the night on their evening news for almost 2 weeks, whereas Fox News led with it as the events continued to unfold. In an effort to curb media bias, no matter how feeble or pointless, some protesters will pressure the media in hopes of more fair treatment. Letters to the editor of Time magazine attempted to pressure the magazine in both directions. The same article written about Ronald Reagan's campaign and published under the heading Hatchet Job prompted letters trying to shame the editor for what the readers considered to be lacking objectivity, and to the other end of the spectrum, suggesting that the Times had offered an editorial endorsement of Ronald Reagan. As mentioned earlier, it is not entirely journalists who lean left or right and therefore slant their reporting to their own beliefs. Whether private or publicly owned, the owners of media have their own motives, political and profitable, which influence the public's opinion. Not only is the bias evident in what is reported, but also in what is not reported. Both sides say there is a media bias in the opposite direction from their own beliefs, and the public's opinion of the media is unflattering. According to surveys, conservatives believe that the media has a liberal bias, whereas liberals have a tendency to believe the media has a conservative bias. The perspective point made is that the further the slant of the news is from their own position, the more likely the individual is to claim media bias, and for that reason, conservatives are more likely to claim evidence of liberal media bias. Studies have found that 52% of cable news stories on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox offered a biased opinion about important issues. Large percentages of cable news media are much more biased and opinionated than those of the network news genre. MSNBC and Fox News are both two cable news media outlets that have added or removed talk show hosts, and probably for their politics. Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski is celebrating its 5th anniversary, and MSNBC has added Rachel Maddow of The Maddow Show. Both news shows have a left-leaning agenda. Bill O'Reilly of The O'Reilly Factor has been on the air for over a decade. Fox's Sean Hannity, who has his own show now simply titled Hannity, was Hannity and Combs. Alan Combs is a liberal journalist who still sometimes offers an adversarial viewpoint on Fox News to the current discussion, as in a fair and balanced debate. The introduction of Fox News Channel on cable in 20% of U.S. towns was credited with the increase from 0.4 to 0.7 percentage points in favor of Republican votes in the presidential elections between 1996 and 2000. The article's position is that between 3 to 28% of its viewers voted Republican. The declared winner of the presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon differs according to whether the viewer watched on television or listened on the radio. While this is not media bias, it does broaden the bias perspective that individuals pay attention to more than just what they hear, but also what they see in the candidates and the actions of a journalist. Journalists communicate with more than just the written word or spoken word. Whether consciously or unconsciously, bias can be communicated through facial expressions, gestures, and tone of voice. Voting behavior can be influenced by the trustworthy journalists charged with delivering the news by simply demonstrating different facial expressions. When saying the two presidential candidates' names in the 1976 and 1984 elections, voters were influenced. During the 1984 presidential campaign, students were asked to rate the facial expressions of the news media. The survey was done without audio. It was determined that Peter Jennings, an ABC reporter, communicated more positive facial expressions than the other major network media. Media bias is not limited to positive or negative attitudes toward a particular candidate or party, but also toward a particular issue, and can non-verbally assert their influence. Perhaps the start of media bias as we know it today was in the 1960 debate between Nixon and Kennedy. Both campaigns were upset because only representatives of the three major networks questioned the candidates and not real journalists. Some even thought that if the commentators had not been present, the two candidates could have discussed and debated the real topics. The New York News complained that those ghostly figures with their backs to the cameras were nothing but distractions. And the New York Mirror was even more critical about the use of commentators asking questions, saying the debate was bad television, and whoever arranged the show either was overawed by the occasion and the personalities, or he just did not know his business. The questions asked by the commentators got the argument just about nowhere. In the future, these fellows can be dispensed with. So it seems the mere presence of news media can be a turn-off for the public. Many journalists discredit the media bias theory, saying that they are as hard on Democrats as they are on Republicans. Media bias is justified and rationalized by journalists who discredit the theory by saying that in essence they overcompensate for their own beliefs of conservatism or liberalism. Further, the news media repudiates the claim that their reports are slanted. All cannot be blamed on the biased media. The public is again ultimately responsible. For example, the news consumption of a particular region will increase according to its local national candidate's preference of liberalism or conservatism. It could be said that the media bias is strictly the doing or undoing of the media and its ownership. However, the U.S. population is a country of busy people, busy with careers, families, sports, volunteering, and social activities, and unfortunately little time to stay informed on one side of the story, much less listening to both sides. We depend on news outlets to be truthful and objective. Journalists can be anywhere and everywhere to bring us the news. As it is often said, though, Just because it's on the internet doesn't make it true, and just because a journalist reports facts doesn't mean that the reporter is reporting objectively. As a country of people who wants answers to questions, often without thinking or investigating, so the responsibility ultimately is ours.